Hey there, Urban Collaborative. My name is Dave Kiyvyra. I'm Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. And I am very excited to have a chance to provide you all with a little bit of a presentation that we recently did at um, the Urban Collaborative at the last meeting this fall in Tempe, Arizona. And it's on closing the comprehension gap in the science of reading. You'll have to forgive me. I am on the road this week, and so I'm joining you from a Marriott hotel in Tucson, Arizona, ironically. But just recently, I was at the CASE conference in Pittsburgh, the Council for Administrators of Special Education, and so many of the presentations that I went there dealt with the science of reading and how districts are struggling to try to implement science of reading instruction, how that looks for students in special education, and does it look different than it does for kids in general education, and what about different state initiatives that are coming in. And one of the questions that was asked in almost every one of the presentations is, because most of the presentations were focused on figuring out how to decode the words on the page. At the end of almost all of these presentations, folks were asking, well, what about comprehension? Right? I got it. I feel like we have a good decoding program, but now what about language comprehension? What about reading comprehension? And the presenters really never had the best answers. I think they would acknowledge they weren't totally sure how it was, aside from rereading text or scaffolding text to try to deal with reading comprehension. So I think that highlights a real absence in the discussion of the science of reading, which is about comprehension. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you're not that familiar with Lindamood-Bell, we are an organization that's been around for more than 30 years. We're focused on language and literacy. And specifically, we're focused on developing the underlying sensory cognitive functions that students need to develop in order to learn how to read and comprehend. And so what we'll talk about today really is a big overview, big picture discussion of what sensory cognitive instruction is. We'll discuss then what the dual coding theory is and concept imagery. We'll talk a little bit about the process of how you develop language comprehension through utilizing concept imagery and what that instruction looks like. And then we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about what does this look like when it's really on the ground and in schools, and what's the impact that instruction in concept imagery can have for students who are struggling with reading and language comprehension. So big picture, as I mentioned before, Lindamood-Bell, we have private learning centers across the country where students are often seen one-on-one and very intensively. And then we also partner with schools and school districts to train teachers in how they can implement our programs with their students. And the programs that we have at Lindamood-Bell really focus on three different sensory cognitive functions, right? The first one being phonemic awareness, which I know we're all really on top of now, right? The ability to perceive and locate sounds within words. And what happens to a word when one of those sounds changes. Another sensory cognitive function, though, is symbol imagery, a little bit less well-known phonemic awareness. Symbol imagery is the ability to essentially orthographically map sounds and letters together within words, right? And a lot of you have probably heard about that term, orthographic mapping. We think about symbol imagery as being the skill that underlies students' ability to orthographically map words, right? So that's what's happening in terms of symbol imagery. And then concept imagery, what we'll mainly be talking about today, is the ability to, I talk about it as to be able to create a movie in your mind. Nancy Bell likes the term image a gestalt, or a whole, to make a movie in your mind for oral and written language, right? And that movie that you create and your ability to keep that movie really focused underlies language comprehension and critical thinking. As a quick example that I often use to think about these different sensory cognitive functions, I think about a very basic word like the word cat, right? If a student's going to sit down and read a passage about a cat, they have to have good phonemic awareness if they don't recognize that word right away, so that they can sound it out, at. If it's a passage about the word about a cat, they're going to come across that same word again. So hopefully they don't have to sound it out all over again. Instead, they can use their symbol imagery to orthographically map that word and then recognize it right away when they see it the next time. And then if they're going to understand what this passage is all about, obviously they have to be able to picture that a cat is a furry animal with pointy ears and a long tail, right? Very simple example, but those are three very distinct brain functions. And students may have deficits or a gap in their ability to access any one of those three sensory cognitive functions, right? So we want to be able to develop all of those so that they all become a strength for our students. And so if we touch just really quickly on again what symbol imagery is that ability to create mental imagery for sounds and letters within words. And it's a sensory cognitive function for orthographic and phonological processing. And so as an example of this, I often in conferences will show the audience a card like this. It's a total nonsense word, but I'll take it away and I'll ask them what it said. And if you were still picturing those letters, F-L-I-S-P, you could think about those in your mind even when you're not looking at them. You could say it says flisp, right? And I could ask you some questions about it. Great, what'd you picture for your third letter? Oh, the third letter was an I. Great, what if you change the I to an A? What would the word say? Oh, it'd say flasp. Nice work. What if you switch the last two letters around? Now what would it say? And hopefully you're all still picturing, we've got F-L-A-S-P now. If we switch the last two letters around, we would get flaps. Right? And that's good symbol imagery. And again, we're working on both orthographic and phonological processing when we're talking about engaging in symbol imagery activities like that. And you can picture a student's ability to hold on to that pattern in their mind and be able to make changes to that and come up with the words that result from those changes really does lead into their ability to do the basic things that we want students to be able to do when they're decoding, right? And if students are struggling with phonemic awareness or symbol imagery, they're going to struggle with weak word attack, weak word recognition, might have difficulty holding on to sight words. Students could have good phonological spelling skills, so maybe they can make it say opportunity, but they can't hold on to the one pattern for that. And obviously, they're having that kind of difficulty with just the basic parts of reading. That's going to impact their ability to read fluently, to be able to fix the mistakes that they make. And it's going to lead to very slow and laborious decoding. Some of these students might be labeled as students with dyslexia or students with characteristics of dyslexia. Others may not, right? And all of that discussion that we just had about all of these different symptoms, phonemic awareness and symbol imagery, one of the ways that people think about reading is to think about Scarborough's reading rope and think about, well, what are all the different pieces that go into reading? Well, all of the pieces that we just talked about have to do really with word recognition. And I would say that for the most part, when I'm hearing people talk about the science of reading, this is really where they're focused, right? They're focused down on word recognition. They're talking about phonological awareness and how do we develop that? Good decoding skills. So does my student have quick and accurate sound spelling correspondence? Can they begin to recognize words that they've been sounding out previously? So are they creating a large sight word base that they have that can be instantly recognized? And this is where I think, 99% of the discussion around the science of reading right now is located around word recognition. And when I was talking about those sensory cognitive functions of phonemic awareness, symbol imagery, and concept imagery, when we think about word recognition, there certainly is discussion of the sensory cognitive function of phonological awareness that's happening there, right? There's also what they're calling spelling sound correspondences here, what we would term good symbol imagery. So that's another sensory cognitive function that's being addressed in the discussion around word recognition. But when we come up to the top part of Scarborough's reading rope and we think about what's located up there, we're talking there about background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. None of those are actually sensory cognitive functions, right? These are just topics to list off. Does my student have background knowledge? Yes or no? Do they have a well-developed vocabulary? Yes or no? But the really critical question that we should be asking ourselves is not, do they have a good vocabulary? Do they have good background knowledge? But what is the sensory cognitive function that we have to develop for students so that they can begin to acquire vocabulary, so that they can begin to acquire background knowledge. And as you might have gotten from this discussion so far, that critical sensory cognitive function is what we call concept imagery. And concept imagery comes from a theory of literacy that's called the dual coding theory. And dual coding theory was developed years ago by a gentleman named Alan Pavio, who's a cognitive psychologist in Canada. And it's been very broadly studied. It's considered one of the strongest current candidates for a unified, scientifically based theory of literacy. And there is some reference down there that you guys can take a look at to find out and read a little bit more about dual coding theory. We're going to take that dual coding theory and turn it into kind of a common understanding that we can have right now. What Alan Pavio was talking about was that cognition, or our ability to understand the language that's coming in, is proportional to the extent that we can link together mental representations and language, right? That when I say the word cat, that makes you picture a furry animal with pointy ears and a long tail. And if I say the word cat to you and you don't picture that, then obviously you don't have cognition of what it is that I'm talking about, right? And we also need to be able to, I need to be able to take the pictures that are living in my mind and be able to use language in such a way to help you see that same picture in your mind. And in that way, we're actually conversing, right? We're discussing and we're able to understand each other. And Pavio talked about really individuals are going to differ very widely in their ability to access these different sensory cognitive systems according to their verbal and nonverbal habits and skills, right? So there is really a parts and whole issue around that sort of idea of imagery. There's symbol imagery for sounds and letters within words, and then there's concept imagery for a whole or oral written language, right? And we think about these ideas of imagery as existing across a language processing spectrum, from students who struggle with decoding and might be labeled down toward the far end of that as students with dyslexia. And those are students who are struggling with symbol imagery and phonemic awareness. And then at the opposite end of that language processing spectrum, we've got students who struggle with comprehension. At the far end of that may be students with autism, right? And many of those students sometimes are what's called hyperlexic. So they can decode just about anything, but they can't comprehend what it was that they just decoded. And the weakness that those students have is one in terms of concept imagery, right? So concept imagery, again, really is that ability to create the imaged gestalt or the movie in your mind. And I do talk a lot about it being like that movie in your mind, because if you've ever had the experience where you've read a book that you really love, it's your favorite book, and then it gets turned into a movie. You go to the movie theater to watch it, and what's the experience that you have? Generally speaking, you'll say to yourself, I didn't really like the movie. Why? Because it didn't look like the movie that you made in your mind, right? You pictured it differently, or they left out entire things, or they added in other pieces. And quite literally, that movie that you're watching on the screen is not matching the movie that you made in your mind when you read that book. And that's what we want to have happen for students when they're reading and when they're listening to stories. We want them creating that vivid, active movie in their mind, especially around the critical information that's occurring. But what happens for a lot of kids is they're holding on to bits and pieces of things, right? And you might have also had the experience where you're reading a book and it's late at night. Maybe you're reading right before bed, and you get to the bottom of the page, and what do you say to yourself? I don't remember anything I just read, right? And it's not that you had any trouble decoding the words. You were decoding the words just fine. It's that you weren't engaged in that active cognitive activity of creating mental imagery for the words that you were reading, right? When we are engaged in that, that's what allows us to put down the book, walk into the other room, and summarize to somebody about what it was that they just read, and help paint that picture for them so that they can see the same characters and the same things that happened in that book. And when students struggle with concept imagery, here's the thing, it's a much more global issue than is a struggle with symbol imagery and phonemic awareness, right? when I struggle with symbol imagery and phonemic awareness, I could always get somebody to read a story to me. If I've got good concept imagery, I'll be able to understand it. But even if I've got good phonemic awareness and good symbol imagery, if I don't have strong concept imagery, somebody can read a story to me or I can read it myself. Either way, I'm not going to get the gestalt of that story. I'm not going to understand what the main idea was, and I'm not going to be able to think critically about it. So weak concept imagery really plays into not just different difficulties with written language comprehension, but also oral language comprehension, right? Critical and logical thinking and problem solving, the ability to follow directions. Seems like a simple one, but that ability to follow multiple step instructions, especially, I should say, has to do with concept imagery, right? Expressing language orally, talk about how there are often two different types of students who you'll see. One student might come in after the weekend and you ask them what they did. And man, it's like you turn the faucet on and you can't get it to turn off. And they're going and they're going and they're going and they're going. You stop them. Finally, get them to stop talking, but you still don't really understand what it was that they just did because it didn't follow any sort of order and included information that couldn't have possibly happened over the weekend. Other kids, you ask them what they did, and what do they say to you? Stuff, right? And here's the reality. That ability to express language orally actually underlies writing. And if you think about what we do in the classroom, so much of the instruction is focused on writing. Very little of the instruction is focused first on helping the students be able to verbalize about what their thinking is before we ask them to start writing, right? So in many ways, instruction in the classroom is putting the cart before the horse, right? We focus on writing, and writing is now going to include, of course, spelling and grammar and sentence structure and everything else, and letter formation, all of these other things that can cause students difficulty, when the most critical thing about good writing is that it's based on good thinking, right? And we can understand what a student is thinking by their ability to verbalize about it, and that verbalization then leads into writing. Grasping humor is one. Students will get physical humor. Somebody slips and falls on a banana peel, but they can't get your sort of play on words joke. Interpreting social situations, cause and effect, which often goes to attempts at behavior modification. The students can't hold on to that. One that's not listed on here is attention-related issues. Again, oftentimes in the classroom, what teachers feel is that the student doesn't understand what's happening in the class because they're not paying attention. We would actually encourage you to switch that thinking around and say that the reason that the student's not paying attention is because they don't understand what's happening in the classroom. And until we can get them to understand what it is that's happening, until we can get those words to turn into pictures and pictures back into words, they're not going to understand what's happening in the classroom. And so they're not going to pay attention as the teacher goes through their lesson, right? So we've talked a bunch about different sensory cognitive functions. Want to make sure we have a good basis in these before we kind of move into the next part and talk a little bit about differences between students. So at Lindamood-Bell, our two primary programs that we utilize with teachers and educators and students are Seeing Stars, which is our decoding program. And that is process-based instruction that intentionally and systematically develops symbol imagery and phonemic awareness. And then Visualizing and Verbalizing is our program that is process-based instruction that intentionally and systematically develops concept imagery, okay? So those are sort of the two big buckets that we think about students falling into. And when I talk about those buckets, I think it's really good to take a look at some data and see what data shows about this difference between students who struggle with symbol imagery and phonemic awareness as compared to students who struggle with concept imagery. And this is from a partnership we had for several years in Fort Smith Public Schools in Arkansas, where we were working with a very large number of students. And these were, or I should say, we were working with the teachers. Teachers, in turn, were working with the students. And one of the things that we train the teachers in doing is to implement a very wide battery of assessments, all publicly available and nationally normed assessments that we train them in how to deliver. And they would then use those assessments to measure where their students were at the beginning of the year. And this is for all of their students that were in tier 3 or in special education. And when they gave this sort of range of assessments, there's an assessment that works on symbol imagery, there's one that measures phonemic awareness, word attack, so ability to sound out words, word recognition, the ability to recognize real words, spelling of real words, then students' ability to read a passage, right? And rate how much, obviously how much time it takes them. Accuracy is how many words they're getting correct as they read. Rate and accuracy combined to give you a fluency score. And then the students are asked questions, higher order thinking questions based on that passage that they just read. So this comp is their reading comprehension. And then separately, they were given an assessment of receptive oral vocabulary, right? So we took all of these students who were, as I mentioned, based on other data assessments, pulled together into tier 3. And we could say, well, okay, we know all of these students struggle with reading. But when you give them this broad array of assessments, what you can see is there are actually two very distinct pools of students. There are students who, you know, we can say if reading, the whole point of reading is comprehension, right? These students, their reading comprehension score comes in at the 18th percentile. So that's below normal. The normal is from the 25th to the 75th, right? These students down here, their reading comprehension comes in at the 16th percentile. So almost the same as this other group of students. But if we take a look at this group of students, the reason why their reading comprehension score is so low is in part because their reading accuracy is at the 6th percentile and their fluency is at the 4th. So that's really, you know, it's amazing that their reading accuracy is at the 6th percentile, but their comprehension is up at the 18th percentile, right? So these are kids who, if we read them the passage, they could probably understand it. For these students down here, though, when we look at them, their reading comprehension scores at the 16th percentile, but look at their reading accuracy. It's up at the 37th percentile, right? And their fluency is at the 32nd percentile. So when we think about these kids, clearly, if they're in tier 3 because they struggle with reading comprehension, but they're struggling with reading comprehension for completely different reasons. And so when we give them an intervention, we want to make sure we're giving them an intervention that's based on where it is that they're struggling. And if we're thinking about that Scarborough's reading rope again, there's that decoding part. We're talking about weaknesses in symbol imagery and phonemic awareness, word attack and word recognition. When we're coming down to these students down here, the students who are doing the visualizing and verbalizing program, these are kids for whom that bottom part of the rope is just fine, right? It's that top part. And what are they struggling with there is comprehension, right? And again, why are they struggling with comprehension? Because they're struggling with concept imagery, okay? So the development of concept imagery really does improve reading and listening comprehension, memory, oral vocabulary, critical thinking and writing. You can think about it in relation to math, right? Certainly concept imagery is crucial for math. Think about your students who memorize their multiplication tables, but you know, they can tell you 7 times 7 and you say, what if you take one of those groups of 7 away? They don't know what the answer is because they don't really understand what they're doing. Concept imagery really is foundational to all academic performance. So imagery is sensory information that prevents language from going in one ear and out the other. Our goal is to create an imaged whole. From that imaged whole, that is how students can then engage in higher order thinking tasks like coming up with the main idea, drawing conclusions, making inferences, all of those things that we want them to do. So I thought it'd be fun to do now if we've got an understanding what the dual coding theory is, how concept imagery plays a role in comprehension. Another thing to think about is, okay, well, what's an example of concept imagery and how would this work? And I thought it'd be interesting just to think about concept imagery in the most basic sense of just vocabulary development, right? If our goal is to help our student to develop their vocabulary, it's really important to be using specific process-based language to help a student develop an image for a term rather than content-based instruction, right? Content-based instruction, if my student's trying to learn the word gorilla and the focus is on the content, what we're often going to do as teachers is what my dad did when I was a kid. Tell me to go look up the word in the dictionary, right? That's content-based. Go look at the definition, memorize the definition. Process-based would be to change your language and talk instead about what do you picture for a gorilla. Versus just saying, what is a gorilla? And here's why that's important, right? Because Let's say the instruction is go look up gorilla in the dictionary, right? If my student goes and looks up gorilla, here's a definition that they might get. A very large, typically black-colored anthropoid ape of equatorial Africa that has a stocky body with broad shoulders and long arms and is less erect and has smaller ears than the chimpanzee. Now, imagine if we've got a kid who we're not sure if they know the vocabulary term gorilla, and we now ask them to go to a dictionary and look it up. This is what they get. I mean, I think I could figure out what an anthropoid is, but that's not actually a term that I know. Equatorial Africa. Wow, we're getting into a lot here. We finally start to get some description going, broad shoulders and long arms, but then we make a comparison to the size of the ears of a chimpanzee. Well, if my student has trouble figuring out what a gorilla is, why would they know what a chimpanzee is, right? And so we're getting a very different discussion when we say to a student, what's the definition of a gorilla? As opposed to saying to a student, what do you picture for a gorilla, right? And we can start to describe our picture. Maybe the student says, I don't know what a gorilla is. And we can start to describe a gorilla, where a gorilla is a very large animal, has sort of long hair, lives in the jungle. It's generally black hair. And the student goes, oh, yeah, I know what a gorilla is, right? And we can use gestures and we can be using description to come up with and create an image for that term, as opposed to focusing on, again, that content-based definition, right? What's important here is to go through a process that is process-based, right? And that it's not about content-based instruction. One of the things Nancy Bell often talks about is it would be so easy if we could just go into a classroom and say to our students, well, I want you to create pictures in your mind for the words that you're reading and hearing. And they'd go, okay, great, got it. I'm going to make pictures. Well, it's not quite that easy, right? We often do in the visualizing and verbalizing program begin with just one word that we're helping the student create a picture for. And actually, going back before that, we have them describe a picture that's in front of them first, before we have them describe a picture that's in their mind. And then we begin to build for picturing from a single word to picturing for a single sentence, and then multiple sentences in a paragraph, and then multiple paragraphs on a page. And through that entire process, we're going through and reading a sentence or having the student read a sentence. And at the end of that, we're stopping and we're saying, what do those words make you picture? Not what was that sentence or what was that about? Because what we need to develop for them is that as words are coming in, it's creating a picture for them in their mind. They've got good sensory input going. And because they've got that, they can monitor, they can hold on to what it is that they're reading and compare and say, does that make sense to me? And when they can say, oh, it doesn't make sense to me, they can go back and they can fix it. And because they can do that, they're an independent reader, right? Go back to that example I gave you earlier of reading a book late at night and you're tired. If you're not creating that movie, you're not actually monitoring. You're not able to hold on to what it is that you're reading and see, does it make sense compared to what you were reading before? And if you made a mistake in the decoding or you missed a sentence, you wouldn't be able to fix it because you weren't aware that you missed a sentence, right? And so you're not actually an independent reader at that point until you're turning on that sensory cognitive act of creating images in your mind for language, okay? And I think that, when we think about partnering with schools, there really are some key differentiators, I think, in process-based instruction and in the work that we do with districts, right? And some of those key differentiators are things like not just saying that my program is a sort of quote unquote science of reading program, but that the program is really actually based on a theory of cognition and that it has been researched. And that the program that you're choosing, whether it's Lindamood-Bell's or not, is developing those underlying processes necessary for reading. And I personally think one of the biggest things, one of the most crucial things, is that our programs at Lindamood-Bell are not scripted. There is certainly language that we use, there's scope and sequence, there's steps, there's materials, but we don't say that this is where you're going to be at 1 week, this is where you are at 2 weeks, this is where you are at 4 weeks, and everybody follows the same pattern, because that's not actually differentiated instruction. I would argue all students, general education, special education, whatever umbrella you put them in, deserve and should get and benefit from real differentiated instruction. But I know for sure when we're in special education, we know that we can't just be giving our kids a scripted program, right? They learn differently, and we need to be able to respond in real time to that. And that comes from really engaging in a form of Socratic interaction. All of the Lindamood-Bell's programs are based on teachers interacting constantly with their students and a consistent back and forth. The programs are not about teacher-proofing instruction. Instead, they are really and truly about raising teacher pedagogy, which is going to impact them not just when they're using our programs, but when they're just teaching all day long with students. Right? One of the other crucial factors that we engage in, and T.R. Gusky has done a lot of research on professional development and how much time needs to occur with it. And he talks about how sort of the one-drop workshop really isn't successful in helping teachers develop their skills in being able to implement a program, and that teachers are going to need probably 30 hours of job-embedded professional development and an opportunity to watch an expert provide the instruction and then engage in some co-teaching. And so we actually have a model in which, generally speaking, we do this virtually, but our virtual consultants can appear in a session with a teacher to model the lesson and then move through a process of co-teaching and then providing feedback to that teacher. And it includes collaborative meetings and asynchronous learning opportunities as well. And of course, one of the most crucial things there is leadership integration. And that means not just district leadership, but principals, and getting principals on board to have an understanding of what these programs do and have opportunities to sit in on a monthly basis and watch a session and debrief with a project manager afterwards. And ultimately, taking a look at data in order to make that very first instance of differentiation, right? Why is my student struggling with reading? What is it? An issue around decoding, or is it an issue around comprehension, or is it both? And that's going to drive then my instructional decisions. And that's crucial because when we want to see changes for students, we have to be basing our assessment and understanding of them on some data, right? So here are those two pools of students that we looked at before, but now we're looking at their pre-test in light blue compared to their post-test in dark blue. These students got 52 hours on average of small group instruction provided to them by a teacher who'd been trained in Seeing Stars program and visualizing and verbalizing, and had been given weekly job-embedded PD in order to help grow their skills. And as you can see, the asterisks here denote statistical significance. So these students who got the Seeing Stars program made statistically significant gains across every single measure. And you can see the big jumps in those decoding scores, right? The symbol imagery, phonemic awareness start to go up. That leads to an improvement in the ability to sound out words, which leads to growth in word recognition, which then leads to a growth in reading accuracy and then fluency. And that ties over to a bump in reading comprehension, right? Now, if we come down and we look at these students that got visualizing and verbalizing instruction, all those decoding parts were pretty good already. Some of them continued to go up, but they were already really high. And when we come down here, we look at their comprehension. Wow, that's where we're really seeing the growth, jumping from the 16th percentile, again, below normal, into the normal range of the 30th percentile for reading comprehension. And the instruction obviously wasn't about their decoding, right? The instruction was about developing their concept imagery, their ability to create images in their mind for language that they're reading, right? When we take a look at these students and we think about, again, those Seeing Stars students, and we think about their growth in terms of standard score changes, so what's the significance of those percentiles? Again, the parts of decoding all grew the most. That led then to growth in accuracy and fluency for those students who were doing the Seeing Stars program and focusing on decoding. And students who were doing visualizing and verbalizing, again, weren't really looking for growth in accuracy and fluency and didn't see that much of it. Where we saw the growth was in reading comprehension. And that's what we ultimately want to have happen for them, okay? Really exciting news that's coming up is we're now engaged in year one of a 5-year study that's funded by Institute of Education Sciences to take a look at students in 3rd through 5th grade who are eligible for Tier 2 or Tier 3 reading intervention. And we're going to be putting this into practice in schools, and American Institutes of Research will be researching on what the models look like, what the differences look like between schools, what the impact is on students over a 5-year period. and then be adding to the research and the understanding of these critical different sensory cognitive functions. So students will be getting either seeing stars or visualizing and verbalizing based on that. And we're really excited to be engaged in this large scale research project. And those are the things that I really wanted to talk about with you today. There's my contact information. If you want to reach out, I'd be more than happy to connect with you and talk in a little bit more detail, and learn a little bit more about what you're doing in your district, where your struggles are, and how it is that we can help support you all. So thank you all very much again. My name is Dave Kiyvyra, Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. And it was an honor and a privilege to be part of the Urban Collaborative and have the opportunity to engage with you all in the amazing work that you all continue to do to change the lives of students. So thank you all very much. And I hope you have a wonderful day.